Hello and welcome to Backwards Compatible, a show that critiques games of the past in long form. This video is the second in a many-part series where I will examine the Uncharted franchise of games created by developer Naughty Dog. In this video, I will be diving deep into Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, and if you haven't played Uncharted 2, I would suggest that you do so before you begin watching this video, as I will be spoiling every plot point. I also suggest you watch my video on Uncharted 1 Drake's Fortune, because I will be referencing criticisms I made in that video. With that out of the way, let's begin. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves released in October of 2009 for the PlayStation 3, just 2 years after Uncharted 1. Immediately, I must begin by saying that this release was far more anticipated than its predecessor. Naughty Dog had shown off the game's intro in one of its early trailers, and it really created a lot of hype surrounding the game, so going through Uncharted 2, expectations are already high. As before, I will talk through the story and plot points, and then talk at length about issues as they arise. We begin not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle. Drake awakens bleeding profusely in some kind of train car, and moments later the perspective shifts and it is revealed that Drake is upside down, the train car hanging off the edge of a cliff. Drake has to climb up the damaged train car to safety, and the sense of peril is real even if you can't actually die here unless you try. It's an incredible opening, and if I were to rank openings in my mind, this would easily be in the top 5. It immediately grabs your attention and has the audience asking all kinds of questions. How did we get here? Who shot Drake? Where is anybody? It's by far the best opening in the series, and I think once again it reinforces the tone of the Uncharted games. You're not meant to take it seriously. Despite what looks to be a critical wound, Nathan Drake is able to still climb up this crumbling train car, even though that's incredibly unrealistic. Drake escapes the train car just as it falls off the cliff, but he's still in danger from both the cold and the chest wound. He passes out for a moment, giving us a flashback. Drake is minding his own business on some tropical island when he is approached by Harry Flynn, one of Drake's former associates from his ventures off-screen. Flynn tries to convince Drake to undertake a heist, stealing an artifact from a Turkish museum. Flynn introduces another character to assist in the heist, Chloe Fraser, who Drake already knows, but Flynn is oblivious to that, and I enjoy the way the dialogue is handled here.
What?
Chloe Fraser.
Nate. Drake. Nathan. Drake.
Hello, Harry.
Chloe here's one of the best drivers in the business. She'll take good care of us.
I bet.
The three chat about their plan, and in doing so surmise that the artifact that their unnamed collector wants is linked to a Marco Polo mystery related to disappearing ships filled with gold. The three decide to go into this for themselves, and the heist is set.
What the hell? I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
For the next few moments, the perspective shifts back and forth with Drake having survived the train car falling and the flashbacks in the past. It's the basic tutorial fare with Drake in the present, but I really enjoy this section because it has the flashbacks to break it up. In the next flashback, Chloe and Drake are revealed to be former lovers of some kind. It seems clear that Elena is out of the picture for the moment. It's not long before the heist begins. Immediately we have a distinct change from Uncharted 1. In that game, Nate would always do climbing sections solo. Here, we have Nathan and Flynn going through the sewers together, climbing and sometimes even somewhat competing. It's a welcome change, but even more welcome is the dialogue that will trigger during sections like this.
From there, we're in. Yeah, in like Flynn, right? What? In like Flynn. I don't get it. Just give me a boost.
It's more than just banter. It feels like natural conversation that might occur, and it's a fantastic way of endearing us to the characters outside of cutscenes, but I'll come back to this later. Exiting the sewers, you enter the museum grounds. I want to point out that in the first hour of Uncharted 2, we've had 4 environments: Snowy Mountain, Tropical Island, sewers, and the museum, a huge shift from Uncharted 1, where it felt like we never really left the jungle. It's such a welcome change, and we are in for more later on, but I particularly enjoy the museum because it's a lived-in area, not an abandoned city or tropical island. The museum is where we are introduced to stealth mechanics, a first in the series. It's simple and straightforward. Go up to an enemy and press a button to engage a stealth kill, provided Drake remains hidden. It adds a new dimension to fights that I will address later. While the museum is a great place to have this tutorial, it can be comical how blind these guards are. Flynn and Drake make an absurd amount of noise traversing the grounds, but hey, maybe the guards hate their jobs. Worth noting too that good banter continues between Drake and Flynn, and it would be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention one of the best lines in the series.
There's a guy above you, there's a guy above you. There's a guy below you, there's a guy below you.
Eventually the pair come upon the room where the treasure they've been seeking is. Nate smashes it carelessly, glad the clue wasn't written on the thing, and finds blue resin inside which he burns that illuminates a map pointing to Borneo. Flynn chooses this moment to announce his betrayal and sabotages Drake's escape. You have to run through the museum attempting to get away from the guards that are shooting you, and eventually you make your escape through the sewers and you think you are home free, not quite. I like this sequence, but I would have loved if Naughty Dog once again granted the player a bit of agency. If they fall behind or misstep, they are simply caught earlier, but you have the chance to evade capture until the very end. Narratively, it doesn't change anything, but it would be a fun reward for making the correct moves in the escape to make it to the manhole. When I played, I legitimately thought I had gotten away and was surprised when it wasn't so. Nate ends up in a Turkish prison for about 3 months until he is freed by his old pal Sully, and even Chloe. Drake thinks Chloe was in on the betrayal, but it turns out she had nothing to do with it, and informs Drake that Flynn went hunting for the ships in Borneo, and the three set off to catch up to them. We are once again in a jungle environment, but this time only for a bit. Drake and Sullivan raid an enemy camp to find more clues, and enter a bit of combat. So, let's talk about how combat is different from Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2. First, the ammo system has been changed, I dare say fixed. In Uncharted 1, weapon drops would change based on what gun you were carrying, basically encouraging swapping weapons over ammo stockpiling. In Uncharted 2, that system might still be there, but to a far lesser degree. You can easily pick up a favorite weapon and you have plenty of bullets for the next encounter, and it feels great. The incentive to switch weapons mid-battle now comes from other, more sensical sources. Enemies far away, enemies that come up close, grenade tosses that displace you from cover. The combat feels much more organic this time around. Drake still has the same options as before, a pistol, a rifle, grenades, but now there are more options outside of the weapons that you choose. Stealth, as mentioned before, is an option to take down as many enemies as you see fit. The game really doesn't prevent you from taking out an entire arena of enemies with just stealth, but it's a challenge to do so. A good mix of stealth and, when that fails, frantic combat is truly the way to go. Stealth is actually pretty limited. Outside of hiding and waiting, there aren't any other tools at your disposal, but at least you can take out enemies around corners and over barriers. It's enough for me, and it works well enough to make the combat encounters in this game far more enjoyable. Worth mentioning as well that hand-to-hand combat is also much better. Drake can now punch and counterattack when a prompt arises. It's a simple system that works well enough when you run out of bullets. Combat arenas have also improved as well. There are less enemies that pop in from nowhere. Now it feels, at least most of the time, that they have a source and a reason why they are there. Combat arenas also feel far more distinct, and I'll point out my favorites as the video goes on, but for now I'll say that each area feels far more naturally constructed. There is, however, still room to improve. Combat encounters are still mostly straightforward, mostly horizontal. The weapon choices are still very limited, and many encounters will still be a series of poking out from cover every now and then to take shots at the enemies. While more exciting than Uncharted 1, firefights still have far more to improve on. Climbing is still seldom used in any of the arenas. Continuing forth, Nate and Sully create a little diversion and make it to the enemy camp, find their next clue which leads them high up in the mountains. At this point, I was expecting a long trek to find the place, but it's actually right there just a few feet outside of camp, and it's shocking Flynn couldn't find it. Once again, Uncharted is lacking some, well, charting. It would be nice to do some exploration, or if that's too much, then at least have places feel earned by how difficult they are to get to. Thankfully, an area later in the game accomplishes this, so I won't dwell on this any further for the moment. Drake, Sully, and now Chloe enter some kind of ruins with a lot of dead bodies and more blue resin. Drake uses it as a torch to find one body with some kind of dagger, called a perma-dagger. Also, Naughty Dog, props for this little bit.
kidding.
Nate, you're gonna give me a goddamn heart attack.
The dagger is this game's key item, something we saw Nate briefly find in the snow in the game's introduction, so we know it'll be important. They leave the ruins only to have Flynn's people catch up to them and Chloe switch sides, although temporarily. Flynn takes the clue that Nate found, which unfortunately happens a lot in this game. In Uncharted 1, there was a distinct problem where Nate would solve a puzzle only to encounter enemies within what were supposed to be secret tunnels. Uncharted 2 doesn't have this problem, it's fixed, but it's exchanged it for something that isn't much better. Nate will solve a puzzle and have the advantage, and it will be taken away from him moments later. It also happens later with the map from the temple in Nepal, and again once they open the path to Shambhala. I know he isn't expecting to get caught in any of these circumstances, but it can still be worthy of an eye roll. There is satisfaction that comes from solving puzzles to be ahead of the enemy. It feels good to earn that. That satisfaction is taken away, however, if the enemy manages to take the clue you worked hard for. I don't know what the solution would be, but I might suggest that Flynn and his boss have to find the clues some way else, or it takes longer for them to get the clue from Drake. He has the advantage for all of 5 minutes. The associated problem with this is if Nathan Drake were to just stop and go home, Shambhala probably would never be found, so it's his fault that Lazarevic, the game's main antagonist and Flynn's boss, almost becomes immortal. Drake and Sully are about to be hauled off when Chloe switches sides back to Drake's, hands him the dagger, and he and Sully escape while being shot at. Drake will be headed to Nepal next, without Sully, to continue pursuit of Shambhala and the Chitamani stone, this game's big treasure and a stone of incredible power, or so says the legend. This particular city in Nepal is currently a war zone. Lazarevic and his forces are brute forcing their way through the city in order to find where the trail to the stone might be. It works well to give context to the game's combat encounters in Nepal. In Uncharted 1 I had a distinct issue with the number of combat encounters and how many enemies would flood an arena, since it was an abandoned, uncharted island. Realistically, why were there so many mercenaries on that island when there was no opposing force that they knew about? Here, the context of them literally taking over the city allows us to suspend disbelief when Drake runs into soldiers after turning every corner, and its context I very much appreciate. First though, a mini set piece where you are running from a truck down an alley and shooting backwards at it. It's nice, simple, and memorable. I don't have anything more to say. Drake must now traverse this ruined city in Nepal. The pacing of combat sections here and climbing is very well done. Just when you are fatigued from combat, a lengthy climbing section will begin, and it's enhanced by Chloe's companionship as you make your way through the city. I did not mention it in my Uncharted 1 review, but I really appreciate the stellar performances from the voice actors. I'm going to play favorites a bit and say that Claudia Black, of Stargate and Farscape fame, really steals the show in this game.
Oh, is that an ancient Tibetan ritual dagger in your pocket?
Oh, maybe I'm just happy to see you.
Yeah, hello.
So this is the key to everything.
Yes, it is. Marco Polo's passport to Shambhala.
What do we do with it?
Ah! I have no idea, actually.
Though Nolan North, Emily Rose, Mitchell McGonigal, and Steve Valentine all do a terrific job. Part of this must be the direction as well. It feels like they are interacting with each other instead of simply reading off a script in a VO booth. Part of this comes from the fact that Uncharted uses mocap for its cutscenes, but I do believe some of the best dialogue happens during gameplay. The writing is very smart too. It's actually a very high mark for a 2009 game to achieve such enthralling characters. Nate and Chloe work their way up to the top of a tower hotel in order to get a better view of the city. It's awesome to see the city from this height, and this place also gives us a great bit of optional dialogue.
Hey, check it out. Marco.
Really?
Come on.
No.
Marco.
Polo.
Fish out of water.
You are so unprofessional.
On the way down, Drake encounters a helicopter that will be chasing him through some buildings, and it becomes a fantastic set-piece moment. Eventually, you are trapped in a collapsing building where your only choice is to jump out just before the whole building comes down. Again, comparing to Uncharted 1, this set piece doesn't break any established rules, but still provides an area that changes up the gameplay. I do have to question these soldiers though, and their lack of sense for self-preservation. And they say loyalty is hard to find. Nate and Chloe then encounter one issue that wasn't really fixed: extreme coincidence. they bump into Elena and her cameraman friend in the middle of the city, and Elena explains that she is on the tail of a war criminal who is the person that Nate is racing for the treasure. Using coincidence as a narrative mechanic is a bit tired, but I can't really say any more about it because it's in every story in some form. Though I do believe this could have easily been solved by having Nate spot someone who looks like Elena from the top of the hotel and gone in that direction. At least that's more believable than what happens. They bump into each other in a random alley in a huge city. Elena is immediately at odds with Chloe. Chloe is headstrong, can climb, focused on her mission and survival. Elena is restrained, more compassionate, and more resistant to Nate. They jab a bit about their relationship with Nate, but now we have an interesting polarity posed to Drake. Two potential love interests. It's not a tired love triangle though. Nate isn't even really with Chloe, but it creates an interesting dynamic in the group that pays off later once the cameraman is injured.
Oh,
Oh, what?
she broke your heart.
Oh, please.
She did,
Hey, you know what?
she?
Maybe I broke hers.
Oh, yes, Casanova.
For now, our group proceeds into the temple they think will house the next clue to Shambhala. Elena and the cameraman have to stay behind. Sorry, I keep calling him cameraman, but he is so obviously some disposable character I can't be bothered to learn his real name. He may as well be wearing a red shirt. Meanwhile, Drake and Chloe enter some kind of puzzle room. So unfortunately, one thing that did not improve at all are puzzles. In this room, Nate must move the statue into a certain position. The solution is literally written down in his journal, so it just becomes a sequence where you know the solution and just have to climb to arrange the statue. Calling this a puzzle is perhaps giving it too much credit. It's not really, but it's what Uncharted unfortunately considers to be a puzzle. It's very similar to the one that occurs shortly later. There's no figuring out to do. The solution is either already provided or blatantly obvious, such with the mirrors here. I am not asking for Uncharted to be a puzzle game, or even have several puzzles. I am asking for there to be a little effort in the ones they do create. I feel as if they are so afraid that someone playing the game will quit their game if they can't figure out a puzzle, so they make them so simple as to not impede the narrative. The end result is that I don't feel like I earned the rewards. In this case, the door to the deeper temple, and later on the location of Shambhala. I think there is a balance that can be struck here to make both camps happy, and without spoiling one of my future videos too much, I think that the puzzles in Uncharted 4 finally accomplish this balance. It is a slight improvement over Uncharted 1 in that at the very least Drake moves during the solving of this puzzle, but it's still not solving a puzzle while moving through the environment that I would still like for the series. Upon discovering a hidden tunnel, Chloe and Drake follow it and fall into a trap. I really wish Naughty Dog had done more of these. It's very cool to fall into and easy to break out of, but because of a totally sensible reason. When they built it, there were no guns, and thus you couldn't shoot the gears. It's unfortunate that this is the last trap in the game. Next, the pair enter a magnificent room with a large-scale version of the Perba-Dagger. It's a very cool moment to climb this thing, and the way the blades fall into place and change Nate's climbing path is very seamless. As mentioned earlier, it's barely a puzzle, and I kinda wish there had been more of these light mirror puzzles, as they work so well for Zelda. Completing the puzzle leads to your reward. Drake and Chloe find this awesome thing, seriously I love how this thing is animated, that shows the mountains and the location of the entrance to Shambhala. Drake stupidly draws the location on a map with a big red marker. I know he doesn't think he's going to get caught, but come on, we just know this thing is going to be taken away. Anyway, the temple has been invaded by soldiers and Nate and Chloe must fight their way out, Nate all the while worrying about Elena. Chloe isn't much help though, unfortunately the AI hasn't progressed too far from Uncharted 1 and she doesn't do much shooting. After fighting your way outside, Elena and her red shirt cameraman are pinned down. Once the enemies are clear, we find out that the cameraman has been wounded, and if he has any hope of living, Nate must carry him to safety while being chased by an army. This is the height of the conflict between Nate, Elena, and Chloe. I hate to be so binary, but Elena and Chloe are pretty akin to the shoulder angel and devil. Elena wants to save her cameraman. Chloe thinks doing so will slow them down and get them all killed. They both have a point though, and despite Nate choosing to save the cameraman, Chloe still does her best to support the decision, though she's clearly frustrated.
All right, get the door open.
He's never gonna make it. We have to leave him.
What? No!
Get the door open,
Gonna
Chloe.
get us all killed!
After a sequence where you carry the cameraman through the streets of the city, you eventually happen upon a point where a person who isn't able-bodied can't continue, giving Nate another decision. It's interesting here that he still chooses Elena's side, even though at this point Elena is being naive, thinking they could somehow get out with the cameraman alive. It all comes to a head when frustration gets the better of Chloe and she turns a gun on the group, attempting to appear like she had tracked them down. Good timing too, because Flynn steps in a moment later with gun drawn. The three are essentially captured once again, and it's finally time for our antagonist to be properly unveiled, Lazarevic. He's a buff Russian dude with a scar down his face. If you had to imagine what a villain looks like, this would probably be pretty close to that. That is to say, he looks fairly generic. It's a shame too, because I think this is fairly late in the story for him to be revealed, though he's been seen from afar and described several times as a war criminal and a monster. Call me greedy, but I think I would have wanted him to look a bit more normal, which would make what he does moments later, shoot the cameraman, a little more impactful. Instead, it's just kind of expected. Really quick, a moment for the cameraman. Moving on, Lazarevic does the normal villain thing and leaves the room before Nate and Elena are killed, presumably so they can escape. They do so, and once clear, make a plan to go to the train yard to save Chloe. Fairly interesting tidbit here is that Elena resists this course of action initially. She doesn't know Chloe and thinks she betrayed them, but it makes sense. I do like the fact that this resistance doesn't last long. I absolutely abhor jealousy as a plot device, and I'm glad this game dodges what could be dreadfully cliché. Elena's justification makes sense, and she and Nate sync up very nicely.
I don't really have much of a choice.
Honor among thieves, huh?
Something like that.
Nate climbs into a rail car and promptly smashes it through the wall of a building, making for a nice mini set piece where he must defend himself from all sides while being attacked. It can be very easy to be overwhelmed in this fight, which is why it is so gripping. The tactics you must employ must be precise, and you can't let any enemy get too close, or you'll be easily overrun. After a set amount of time, Elena picks you up in a car and begins pursuit of the train where Flynn, Lazarevic, and Chloe are. The driving doesn't last long, and Nate is able to jump onto the last car of the train. This begins one of the best parts of any of the Uncharted games. When I say set piece moment, I usually mean any time something is set up in an interesting way. This can be big moments such as the falling building earlier in the game, or it can be smaller moments such as when Nate is running from the truck or is hanging onto the signs here, unable to jump elsewhere. Usually some rules change, but the basic notion is that it's a change up from normal gameplay. Nate just isn't walking into another arena and hiding behind cover. Something has been altered and he can't use his normal tactics. I don't know if that's the definition that everyone else goes with, but I think it's the one that fits. Interestingly enough, most set-piece moments don't last very long. This is not the case for the train. The train chapter is a spectacular construct of video game tech and gameplay. I don't claim to know much about video game design, but I have to imagine this area is very difficult to pull off. There is a reason we don't see a lot of moving environments in games. There's also the art. We begin by going through some kind of jungle environment, but there are lakes and mountains in the distance as well. I'm sure if you stood long enough, you'd eventually see a pattern emerge when the lake happens, when the train goes over the bridge, but it definitely isn't something I could notice during normal gameplay. Later on, there are rail alarm things that come up too, and they are somewhat dynamically generated based on Nate's position on the train. You can also look forward when the train is performing a turn, and you'll see the cars you'll eventually get to. And without looking too closely, I do think it's accurate. All of this is saying what a remarkable setting it is, and I haven't even gotten to the gameplay. Nate is constantly pushed forward while on the train. Immediately we are taught that you can traverse both the outside and inside of some train cars, and that will be important later. Each fight requires a mishmash of tactics. Nate can come in from above, below, from the side, and you can even stealth through some of it. Later on, you can use those train barriers to hit enemies who aren't paying attention, and it's fairly satisfying. You'll also be fighting another helicopter while on this train, and there's a real sense of danger, though I'm not sure a helicopter blowing up half the train is the smart thing to do to kill one person. You don't have any offensive means for a while, and are almost killed when the train enters a tunnel unexpectedly. There is some fighting in a tunnel, and then the train emerges in a snowy mountain area, and it's as glorious as going through the jungle. It's at this point where I imagine people are expecting the moment from the game's prologue to begin to take place. The helicopter re-emerges and you're able to take it down this time. Eventually, you end up in hand-to-hand combat with a guy who has your dagger, and Chloe appears from nowhere to shoot him. Chloe wishes that Nate hadn't followed her, but he still wants to help her. It doesn't matter though, because Flynn appears to give Nate his gunshot wound, and now we know what will happen soon. Nate backs up a car and decides to do something truly desperate, shooting some barrels which cause an explosion and the train to derail. Really quick, I want to mention something, because I did give Uncharted 1 a very hard time, so it's only fair that I be unnecessarily critical here. This setup is a bit of a cheat. The car Nate sits down in is nothing like it actually looked like when Nate went through it moments ago, and there were definitely no exploding barrels. The car isn't attached in this cut, but it is in the next. I know I'm nitpicking, but it does bother me. Finally, we are where we began the game. The rules change slightly to make the scene a little different since you'll play through it twice. Nate's a little more mobile, some sections are done automatically, and there's some new dialogue. It's an appreciated little feature. Eventually, Nate ends up back where he was when he found the dagger in the snow, and then there's a large fight here that's fairly satisfying because there's a good amount of stealth that can be done, weapon variety, and cover that lets you change up this fight every time. Nate passes out in the snow but is rescued and wakes up in some stranger's house in a mountain village. This is a great quiet sequence, enhanced by the fact that your savior doesn't speak your language, allowing the atmosphere not to be ruined by much exposition. You get to stroll through here and interact a little with the locals, and walking through this place makes the later sequence where you have to fight through these streets all the more memorable. I also want to point out that this begins one of the longest non-combat sections in the game. There's only a couple minor fights that aren't even cover shooting sections. It's a very nice break to contrast both the part before, on the train, and the part after with the village under attack. It's something that Uncharted 1 never came close to having, and it shows Naughty Dog's progression. It seems like they no longer fear having long stretches without combat like they did in the first game. The non-combat or quiet parts increase as the series goes on, but it really started with Uncharted 2. I want to state for the record that while I gush about quiet sections, I never want Uncharted to ditch combat. I enjoy the combat, especially from Uncharted 2 on, but while the gunplay and encounter design as well as the sheer options in combat improves for each entry in the series, I have always felt it is nevertheless anchored by good story and great writing. Likewise, the writing is given context by the intense combat and moments that make the journey feel earned. The biggest payoffs in the game come from clearing a feat before, and if you don't do that, you might as well watch the cutscenes online. People do, sure, but I do believe I don't because I've tried watching cutscenes online before and it just doesn't do anything for me. I suppose what I am trying to say is what Uncharted 2 does very well is payoff. Clearing a large section of either combat, climbing, or whatever to find what's at the end. Now I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll return to this point later. Drake follows the stranger, whose name is Tenzin, to a house where Elena is waiting. Another extreme convenience, sure, but not as bad as some of them. The real cheap shot here is how Elena understands this, probably rare, rural language in Nepal. Surely Schaefer could have played translator.
Schaefer go desha.
Yeah, Nia got to song. Come on, there's somebody who's anxious to meet you.
Speaking of which, we are introduced to yet another character named Schaefer. I can't say he plays a major role, but at least his fate isn't blatantly obvious. He acts as a wise man archetype, and points Nate in a direction where he may learn more about Shambhala and the Chintamani stone. Nate sets off with Tenzin on a little journey, taking them through some snowy mountains. I love that Tenzin is the companion here because they don't understand each other, which means Nate will banter to himself and it can be quite charming.
Yeah, good luck, pal. I mean, that's almost impossible to... Oh, you did it. Nice.
It also adds to the quietness of this section, which may have been ruined by two characters cracking jokes. This section is also the first time in an Uncharted game that I actually felt like I was charting something. It's still super linear, but at least I felt like I was going from point A to point B instead of just starting from outside point B. I think it's disappointing then when you just stumble upon the ruins you were looking for. I would have much preferred to have seen them from far away and progressed to them, even if both circumstances essentially had me funneled in the same correct direction. Just before the ruins, we encounter some kind of Yeti beast. Drake has to run and gun and engage in a few quick-time events using hand-to-hand combat. Nothing too spectacular, but I like these beast things a lot, especially before they are revealed to be human. I especially like how they are first shown using forced perspective. Once they hurt the beast enough to scare it off, Nate and Tenzin enter some kind of ruins. It's heavy on the climbing and light on everything else, but it's great just because of how creative it is. Drake will climb on cogs, counterweights, and on giant bell things. The whole thing provides interesting eye candy so the climbing doesn't become too mundane. And seeing this crazy statue here is a nice reward.
Good sign.
In the next room, Nate discovers that Schaefer once led an expedition of Nazis to somewhere. It isn't quite clear, but apparently they obtained some of the blue resin. Nate deduces that Schaefer was forced to kill them after they ate the resin, but it's all kind of cobbled together. Once again, Nazis are in the plot for no reason. And to be fair, even though I enjoy this quiet section of the game a great deal, it's a complete non sequitur. Schaefer's reason for sending Nate this way is so that he can learn the truth, but that's stupid for many reasons. Firstly, Nate is able to deduce what happened here, but that wasn't a guarantee that he would. The bodies may not even be there anymore, and the whole ruins area might be inaccessible. It's been several decades. Secondly, it's incredibly treacherous to get there. I can't imagine it would have been a good idea at all over Schaefer simply telling Nate the truth about the stone. It's not like Nate had been hell-bent at finding the treasure currently, in fact it seems fairly low priority. Lastly, it's unclear how any of this ties in with Shambhala at all. I've reasoned in my head that it's some kind of power generator for the city, but it may have no connection. It's not the location Nate found earlier in Nepal. Nate only goes here because Schaefer told him that this is where he led his expedition and apparently killed his men when he discovered the truth about the stone and the resin. But if it's not Shambhala, then why do we even have the resin there? I'm not sure, but it's best to move on, I guess. Tenzin and Drake are ambushed by the Yeti monsters and board an ancient elevator to escape. They arrive at a vantage point to see Tenzin's village under attack, and we begin the next chapter trying to save it. As I mentioned before, this is a great combat arena because we got to see it when it was a quiet, peaceful town, so you may feel somewhat invested in saving it. There's also some great level design here, in particular this one area where there is a mounted gun on the left and a passage on the right. There are many ways you can handle this area. Go left to take out and steal the turret, go right to kill the bunkered enemies, or a combination of both. When I originally played this game, I didn't even know I could get up on the left to take out the gunner, but you can and it makes the fight much easier except for the extra enemies that trigger if you decide to use the turret. It's really a great arena, but there are more here, many that play with verticality with Nate jumping from roof to roof, firing above and below him. This leads to a section that pits you against a tank, which is a fun little part where you play cat and mouse with the tank, much like earlier with the helicopter, until you can finally take it out. It's great because you, the player, have to be constantly aware of multiple threats, though it is very easy to die here just because of the sheer number of things shooting you. Also, this is another one of those moments where Naughty Dog wants you to do things their way. Getting close to the tank is an instant death, and despite the fact that you can hit the tank with multiple RPGs, only the last one will kill it so you can skip the first several. Next up is one of the game's big set pieces, and one that Naughty Dog will actually iterate on twice in future games, but it's worth noting how well it stands up today. Like the train sequence, there's a sense of motion to enjoy as Nathan hops between trucks on the cliffside road here, jumping as needed away from trucks that are about to explode. It's very active, and although you are unlikely to have to think too quickly, it can be incredibly rewarding to jump just in the nick of time. You do have to suspend your disbelief a little. These drivers don't react in the slightest to anything that happens to their trucks or the trucks around them. But aside from that, it makes for a very well-crafted sequence. It ends with Nate and Elena nearly being tossed off a cliff, but they survive to make their way to the monastery.
There's no way they survived that. Let's go.
The monastery is abandoned, and Nate and Elena must traverse it while also avoiding as many of Lazarevic's men as possible. And Elena puts another crutch on Nate as she is not the climber that Chloe is. This works well to contrast the two female leads. You'll have to help Elena along. It isn't so automatic. The fights in here are also quite varied and well paced, with short climbing sections in between. There is one section I do want to point out as one of the game's biggest sins. Uncharted isn't a stealth game, really. Each encounter is best handled with a combination of stealth and straight up shooting, but I do believe full stealth is an option if you are skilled enough. This is what makes this part so infuriating. Nate infiltrates a tower structure by climbing the side until he reaches the top. The game encourages you to take out the first couple of enemies via stealth, so at this point you might want to go full stealth, which is what I tried to do, yet I was always thwarted. I replayed this part dozens of times. Each time I would be discovered and assume it was my fault and someone was seeing me or hearing me somehow. Well, unfortunately, what isn't clear to you, the player, is that this part actually cannot be done with pure stealth. And not because someone sees you or something, it's actually due to an invisible trigger you hit when descending to this level of the tower. There's no indication, auditory or visual, that this happens. Normally this is the kind of thing I would expect to see handled in a cutscene. Nate jumps down, makes a loud noise, and the soldiers discover him. Instead it's handled during live gameplay, and it looks like all the guards became omniscient. It's so unclear that, like me, players can be stuck trying to do this part over and over again, not realizing that it isn't possible. Why is this trigger here? Well, it's because the next cutscene relies on Nate having been discovered by the enemy, so naturally he can't kill everyone via stealth. There's a similar issue with the scene in The Last of Us, where Ellie is covering Joel with a rifle. That encounter cannot be completed via stealth either, despite no indication of the fact. Naughty Dog works very hard to employ good game design most of the time that it's bizarre something like this exists. Moving along, there are a couple combat sections here with Nate utilizing a sniper rifle. Again, it's not standard combat fare. Nate is using a new weapon at long range while also being stormed by soldiers on ground level, while under RPG fire from above. It feels both fresh and intense. The next section is similarly nuanced, as Nate is suppressed by sniper fire, and without a sniper rifle to use in return until he can climb his way up to it. Or, maybe you save the sniper rifle from earlier and use it to make this part a bit easier on yourself. What I'm getting at is just how much contrast there is between the combat in this game to the combat in Uncharted 1. In Uncharted 1, the only thing that really changed was the arena. But the guns and tactics remained unchanged fight to fight. It was always about peeking out over cover to take out enemies with almost no variation. Here, in the monastery alone, each section has felt quite unique, and while there are certainly sections of Uncharted 2 that are standard fare cover shooting, it's incredibly reduced when compared to Uncharted 1. After this sniper section ends, Nate finds himself on a collapsing bridge. Going to take issue with this, much like the balcony in Uncharted 1, there is no logic to how this bridge breaks. Anyway, moving on, we reach more combat in the central part of the monastery, and this is much more the standard covered shooter fare, although it is still much better because Nate still has more options. For example, you can grab a riot shield from an enemy and proceed using that. I wouldn't say it's enough, but it's improvement. Eventually, Nate and Elena fight their way to Schaefer, which is rewarding because this time you are actually following him. You didn't just happen upon his location, and he is near death. He tells Drake to ensure that Lazarevic is unable to use the stone, and Nate sets out to do so. He is given his be a hero motivation. It's nice to see, sure, but I think it's unnecessary, especially from a character that means almost nothing to us, the player, or Nate. Nate for some reason highly regards Schaefer even though he's in 2 scenes in the entire game. It just comes off a bit forced.
Do you think all this really could be true?
I don't know. But he believed it. That's enough for me.
I don't mind if Nate's reason to push forward was to see this adventure through, to at least see Shambhala or maybe to save Chloe, but this doomsday scenario presented by Schaefer feels a little unearned. We don't even really know what the resin does or that it is responsible for the Yeti monsters. Drake makes his way to a tower where Chloe is. He, at this point, casts aside Chloe in favor of trying to complete his mission of destroying the Chintamani stone. He retrieves the dagger from Chloe and then has to solve a puzzle in the room, another one of those just read your book puzzles to find the solution. It opens up a switch in another part of the monastery and Nate must make his way there. Once that switch is used, it opens up the path to Shambhala underneath this tree here. It's worth noting how much improved this third act is over Uncharted 1's, for the sheer reason that as Drake you feel like you are pulling ahead of the bad guys, not entering a secret path to find the enemy already there. Nate and Elena enter the secret path to Shambhala and, huge shocker, they are followed and confronted by Flynn and Lazarevic. The road closes ahead of them, so Lazarevic threatens Elena and Chloe so that Drake will climb around and fix the road, and he does this with Flynn. It's a tense moment to be climbing around this area with Flynn, bantering while life and death is in order, but it feels unique at the same time. Once on the other side, you are confronted with a short puzzle before being ambushed by the Yeti monsters. You can't seem to do much against them until Lazarevic arrives to kill them. This reveals that the Yetis are actually transformed humans, guardians of Shambhala in a way. They are a little more human-like than the monsters in Uncharted 1 in that they use weapons, but hop around supernaturally. Finally, Nathan works to open the gates of Shambhala, and my goodness, does it look beautiful. One of my favorite things in games is a visual payoff. The era of YouTube has kind of ruined this. You can see every ending of every game available, but there used to be something so special about spending hours completing a game to arrive at its final moment to be confronted with something wonderfully beautiful. I would sometimes play entire games just to see the one sequence toward the end. Uncharted has this nailed. I'm always excited to see Shambhala in all its glory. The only shame is that there is no quiet in the city. It's mostly combat encounters all the way until the end. But I want to say nevertheless how amazingly detailed the city is. Just in time, some Guardian monsters attack and distract Lazarevic from killing you, allowing Chloe, Elena, and Drake to get away. Like I said, the city is mainly combat encounters with the main twist that you now have to deal with the Guardians as well, and in a couple instances you can let the Guardians and soldiers battle it out. There's also another mechanic introduced with exploding blue sap, but it doesn't have too much utility. Eventually you reach the central pyramid and enter a cutscene where you discover that the Chintamani stone isn't a stone, but resin amber, from the Tree of Life located in Shambhala. Shortly after this, Nate decides he has to stop Lazarevic, who is at the Tree of Life, but before that, Flynn appears with a live grenade that Lazarevic gave him. He aims to take our heroes out, and because the pin is already pulled, him as well. He confirms just how evil he is by letting it detonate, which badly wounds Elena. On one hand, I'm glad they didn't go for the redemption story arc here. Flynn was a character I won't miss, but I'm not sure I buy him killing himself and trying to kill Nate and others. Maybe he didn't see another choice. With Elena gravely injured, Nate is hesitant to go forward, but Chloe assures him that she will get Elena to safety, so Nate proceeds to stop Lazarevic. Nate catches him in the midst of drinking from the sap of the Tree of Life, and the scar on his face miraculously disappears, giving us indication that the enemy is now more than human. Nate shoots the pool of sap, which ignites, and begins to destroy the tree in the city. This is where the final boss battle takes place. Drake must run around a small arena and use the exploding pockets of sap to damage Lazarevic, as regular weapons won't do. Comparing this to the final boss of the first game, it's substantially better. Both Lazarevic and Navarro can't be hurt conventionally, but with Lazarevic it makes sense. He's been enhanced by the sap, whereas Navarro wasn't given an explanation why he couldn't be harmed. Navarro's arena was incredibly restrictive. You couldn't move forward and flank because Navarro would auto-kill you, whereas no movement rules are really broken by Lazarevic's arena. He will still absolutely destroy you if you get too close, but you can technically run by him. It doesn't really test your cover shooting skills, but it does test your ability to run around an environment while gunning, which is a skill revisited many times in Uncharted 2. Eventually you hurt him enough to incapacitate him, and the Guardians, probably pissed about their tree, come to finish him off. Nate runs to escape the city in an incredible sequence where the city is crumbling and you have to run across a collapsing bridge. It's insanely well done. It culminates in a short sequence where you have to shoot a Guardian about to pull Chloe off an edge. The three of you escape Shambhala and briefly look back at the destroyed city. Elena is still very hurt, however, and falls unconscious. The game cuts to black. Back at the village, Nate is waiting on something and it turns out to be for Elena's recovery. It's a short epilogue where Chloe and Nate reconcile, and Sully is there, I suppose, out of concern for Elena. It's one of my favorite scenes for how well written it is. None of the love triangle stuff ends up being cringy. It's a very sweet resolution. Nate and Elena seem to be back together and perhaps a little more solid than at the end of Uncharted 1. And then, well, just listen.
So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how scared were you that I was gonna die?
4.
4?
Yeah, why?
A 4.
Yeah.
You were at least an 8.
An 8?
You were a total 8.
An 8? Those Guardian things were an 8.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, those were terrifying.
What's a 10?
Clowns?
Clowns over my death?
I hate
Clowns?
clowns. I hate clowns.
Oh my word. You thought I was dead.
No.
No, you thought I was
No,
gone. Yes,
no.
you did.
No, I
saw
had you all
shed
along.
tears. You shed a bunch of them.
Tears?
Mhm.
It was raining.
No, it was not.
You were unconscious and it was
It
raining.
was totally sunny out and you were bawling.
It wasn't sunny. You were unconscious.
Whatever. I kept your tears in a jar. I have proof.
I'll give you 5. How's that?
So that's Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, but let's talk about some things in general. I know I've gushed about this game a lot, but that mainly comes from how improved it is over Uncharted 1. Let's take a look at my prior criticisms and see if they were fixed or not. I had problems with Uncharted 1's combat, both the mechanics and its arenas. For the most part, this has been addressed. The ammo gaming system is almost completely gone, enemies no longer spawn in from anywhere and are given a little more justification for popping up in certain places. And Drake now has more options in combat. It still has farther to go. While I enjoy the combat, it isn't the strongest it could be, but it's not impacting the game negatively like in Drake's Fortune. I complained how Naughty Dog forces the player into doing only what they want. This still happens, but it's much more subtle. There are fewer deaths that are caused from going off the beaten path, and in general I didn't feel like I had a person over my shoulder. Aside from some water that instantly kills Drake and the invisible trigger I mentioned before, I didn't run into anything truly egregious. I said the story and character motivations sometimes didn't add up, and without going into too much detail, I would say that this game has far fewer plot holes, and Drake's motivations don't constantly switch like they did in Uncharted 1. There are other complaints I had about the first game, but if you want to see those, I suggest watching that video. But to sum up, I would say that Naughty Dog has addressed almost all of them. The biggest negatives of this game are minor. The villain isn't exciting, the combat isn't quite there, and there's still very little choice in traversing environments. The puzzles also aren't satisfying. But those are minor complaints. They don't distract from the game in my opinion. It's no secret if you've watched this video that I consider Uncharted 2 to be an incredibly good game. It's not only a remarkable improvement over Uncharted 1, but it stands on its own as a fantastic action-adventure game. Every time I play it, I question whether or not I will enjoy it as much as I had on prior playthroughs, and while nothing is ever as good as that first time through, I still thoroughly love it even though I've seen all the cutscenes and know everything that will happen. I do believe it's about the journey. Despite everything, playing Uncharted feels like an adventure in a way many games do not, or at least they do not produce the same kind of feel. I still have many wants for the game. I wish there were more death traps, I want there to be more exploration, maybe some more choice, etc, etc. I could go on. For now, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves stands as a phenomenal adventure worth undertaking. In the next video, I will be talking about Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, taking us away from the snow and into the deserts. Backwards Compatible is a video series looking back at older games in long form. If you enjoy it, I hope you'll like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at Mishakos, and support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mishakos. If you're a $1 and up patron, you will receive Backwards Compatible a week early. Thanks everyone and have a wonderful day.